Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. On this week's program, exploring points-based immigration and how the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg could affect immigration lawsuits in federal courts. All that's just ahead. Stick around. A new BPC paper explores how Canada and Australia transitioned to points-based immigration systems. These systems have been hot topics in the conversations here about legal immigration reform and moving to what is often erroneously called a merit-based immigration system, rather than the traditional family-based system. In our first segment this week, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and Senior Immigration Policy Analyst Cris Ramón talk with Cornell University's Mack Eason, co-author of a recent paper outlining a proposed pilot immigration system to target highly skilled foreign workers based on those in Canada and Australia. Here's their conversation.
So in one of his first addresses to Congress, President Trump talked about wanting to reform America's legal immigration system to make it more, quote, merit-based. This term is one that's often been applied to points-based immigration systems such as exist in Canada and Australia. In fact, over many years, researchers, immigration experts, and others have explored the idea of creating such a system for the United States. And bills have been introduced in Congress, but so far nothing has been enacted. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into this idea and whether it could work here. Recently, two immigration law experts from Cornell University released a paper called Recruiting for the Future, a realistic points-based visa system for the United States. In this paper, the authors propose a system they believe is both workable and politically possible. And we're happy to have one of the report's authors, Mack Eason, here with us on This Week in Immigration. Welcome, Mack.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
BPC also released a new report this week by Senior Policy Analyst Cris Ramón and BPC's former intern Angelina Downs called Immigration Systems in Transition, examining the evolution of Canada and Australia's point systems, and also looked at other countries such as Japan and New Zealand to try to understand the factors that were involved in the success of those programs and whether they could be replicated here. And we're going to discuss that report as well. Cris, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So Mack, we're going to start with you. First, why did you and your co-author, Stephen Yeller, embark on this project?
So I give Steve all the credit for initiating this project. He's had a longstanding interest in point systems. He co-wrote a couple of books and articles on the topic over the last couple of decades. So he decided to come back to this topic in 2018, as largely because, as you mentioned, President Trump and the Trump administration have been raising this as a topic that they would like to push, to use in immigration reforms. And then he hired me on as a consultant, as a co-author, as a fellow researcher to dive into the recent history of points-based programs.
So why do you think there's so much attention on this idea of a points-based or merit-based system? And you go into a little bit in the paper, but describe me the difference between merit-based and points-based.
Okay, so I'll take the question of difference and definition first. So in a policy context, the terms merit-based immigration and skills-based immigration, or sometimes even talent-based immigration, are used relatively interchangeably, and they generally refer to immigration systems in which candidates for immigration are selected, at least in part, by the state rather than potential employers alone. And they're selected on the basis of their skills, talents, training, or other human capital attributes. Some of the confusion between these terms is partly due to differences in usage in policy context, but also some of it, as you have alluded to, in the context of U.S. politics, merit-based immigration has also been used as a political buzzword or rhetorical shorthand that's used to signal support for a more general shift in the goals and purposes of immigration policy, away from the family stream immigration and humanitarian immigration and towards a more economic stream immigration. So that's the definitions for merit-based immigration. Points-based selection systems are one policy tool, one of several possible ways that lawmakers can use to administer a merit-based immigration program. So points-based immigration systems or selection systems assess prospective immigrants according to a quantified scoring system that measures factors like education level, employment experience, familiarity with the receiving country's language and culture, and or whether they have arranged employment. The scores assigned to each one of these factors are then collected in a kind of points table, similar to a grading rubric used in schools, that guides the evaluation of each application. So given those definitions, I think there's kind of two answers to the question of why is there so much attention. The short answer, I think, really, is that points-based systems are back in the center of public debate, largely because of the long-standing and consistent embrace of the idea by President Trump and members of his administration. That embrace, that support for, merit-based immigration reform, quote unquote, has been consistent, but it hasn't been particularly deep. The Trump administration has not yet put out any sort of detailed guidance as to what that merit-based immigration reform would look like, or introduced any bills in Congress. I think the longer answer to the question of why there's so much attention on these kinds of systems is that they make a certain dry technocratic charm. The idea of using a transparent scoring system to give out visas based on individual merit is pretty easy to describe. It's simple to understand, and it's intuitively attractive. And I think it really resonates with kind of core values emphasized in the American cultural milieu. So among a populace that's raised in schools that use grades, and in a culture that espouses the ideas of a meritocracy, a points-based visa program seems like a fair, reasonable answer to a difficult political question.
So let's talk about what you and Stephen put together. Can you briefly describe the system that you devised?
Yes. So the idea of introducing a points-based system in the U.S. is really by no means new. Some of the legislation to that effect was introduced back in the 1970s. Throughout, there were multiple attempts to enact some sort of a points-based program in the U.S., but they were all contained in larger comprehensive immigration reform bills. So the system that we devised, we put together a legislative proposal that, if enacted, would create a small pilot program that would allocate 50,000 green cards each year to high-skilled foreign workers selected through a kind of bespoke points-based selection system. In this selection system, candidates would be assessed and assigned a numerical score according to a points rubric that we weighted towards longer-term human capital factors like educational attainment, age, experience, teamwork, and linguistic abilities. This points-based pilot program would have a single application stream, and it would be managed through an expression of interest system, application system like in Canada or Australia. And in addition to this small pilot program, our proposal recommends that Congress put in place a number of institutional support mechanisms, like guidelines and financial support for gathering longitudinal data on employment outcomes of admitted foreign workers, provisions requiring a periodic review of the program by congressional committees, and the establishment of a standing advisory board consisting of immigration experts and stakeholders. These are really designed to ensure that the program works, that it's effective and flexible and transparent.
So you described some of the factors and values in the system, among which are that you've decided it's only going to be a pilot program and that it's only aimed at high skill. What other sort of major considerations or values did you use in constructing, and why do you think these are the right ones for the United States at this time?
Well, we cast this as a standalone pilot program, and we started with just a single visa stream aimed at high-skilled foreign workers for largely the same reason. It's a good place to start. If comprehensive immigration reform is a difficult road to go down, then going with a piecemeal and a pilot program, a time-limited pilot program, is a politically it's less politically costly. Some of the other considerations that we focused on, as I mentioned, our points rubric is weighted towards longer-term human capital needs of the U.S. economy and the U.S. job market. We focus on the long-term labor market needs because the U.S. already has a number of existing labor immigration programs, but they almost all focus on short-term labor needs. Candidates are selected or sponsored by employers for immediate needs in the labor market. Our proposed program is meant to be an additive. It's meant to be to complement existing immigration programs, that by focusing on long-term human capital needs in the U.S., so it kind of fills what we saw as a policy gap in U.S. economic immigration policies.
So when you were working on this project and designing this program, what were some of the hardest parts of this proposal to devise, and what trade-offs did you make?
So there were a number of trade-offs that we aimed for. So as your listeners might be aware, points-based immigration or merit-based immigration has been recently associated mostly with the political right. What we aimed to do was to kind of go back to the origins of points-based immigration systems. The earliest of these were introduced in bills drafted in bipartisan bills, partly sponsored or co-authored by Senator Ted Kennedy. This was at its beginnings fundamentally kind of liberal technocratic idea. So in the hardest parts to devise for us were the ways to kind of make this palatable both to the left and the right. It aims both to stimulate the U.S. economy and to address labor market needs, but also to do so in ways that don't perpetuate systemic racial or gender biases that other point systems around the world have had, that in terms of unequal outcomes according to those two factors.
So how did you incorporate those ideas? What specifically did you do to try to address some of those issues?
We included two factors that were kind of bonus points available. One of them was specifically we allocated a points bonus to applicants who are non-male, phrased in that way to be as inclusive as possible. And then we had a second category in which we allocated additional points to applicants coming from who are nationals of a developing country. So both of those points categories that we allocated in our points table were meant to counteract a phenomenon that has been observed in the academic literature on points-based systems around the world. A number of scholars have pointed out that in the points-based systems in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, the three oldest points-based systems, there is a consistent pattern of disparate outcomes for women and for individuals that are not coming from, say, European or OECD countries. There's a lower proportion of applicants who are admitted of both of those categories than you would expect based on kind of random chance or distributions of actual skill. And there's a number of reasons for those factors. Unfortunately, immigration policy is a rather blunt tool to address those kinds of systemic issues. So these are first steps towards accounting for or counteracting those systemic inequalities.
So you title your paper A Realistic Proposal. Why do you think this proposal is realistic and politically possible?
So for a number of reasons. One, the idea of having some sort of points-based selection system for a merit-based visa program has been consistently popular among the American public. So in recent public opinion polls, as well as polls conducted over the last decade, a majority of Americans have consistently expressed support for skilled immigration and have expressed support for this kind of selection system. We think, so there's the political will there, and there's political support for this. One of the obstacles to a points-based immigration system that has been consistent across past attempts to enact one has been that there is some political cost associated with signing on to it. So we think that by designing our proposal as a standalone system and with a pilot program that is time limited to 10 years, that lowers the political price tag for signing on or giving this program a chance. The benefit of being able to do, although there were costs that came with making it a pilot program and a temporary program, we think that in the long run, if enacted, this program would provide a real world test case to answer the question of whether a point system would actually work here in the US.
So, Cris, let's now turn to your report. BPC hosted a webinar on September 29th to discuss your report, and you moderated a panel of wonderful experts from Canada, Japan, and the United States to discuss their points-based immigration systems. But let's talk about the findings of your report. What were the key takeaways from your report?
Yeah, so the genesis of the report was when we were looking at this discussion about implementing a points-based system in the United States. The thing that we noticed is that people really harp on the selection of migrants. They really focus on the points, go into those details, but they don't really think about the institutional contexts that allow these countries to implement and revise these systems over time, which actually makes them successful. So we looked at the evolution of the Australian-Canadian system from basically the 1960s until this past decade. And there were three core themes that came out in the research. One is that the governments in these countries sought out public support for skilled migration at different points in time, especially when they needed to prioritize skilled migration or expand skilled migration to deal with economic issues or population loss. That's theme number one. Theme number two, and I think this is actually very important because this is where I kind of look at American proposals. I'm like, it's not quite right. Canada and Australia have, not only are they parliamentary systems, which means that, the parliament and the executive are one and the same, and that there's party line voting that means legislation can get passed really quickly. Canada and Australia also have legal authorities or regulatory instruments to make dramatic changes to the immigration system without legislation. And so they're able to make big changes without having to consult with Parliament, and can just simply give an instruction to the bureaucracy, and that change can be made very quickly. And the last bit is that they gather longitudinal data that provides them with actionable data to make decisions as to whether what parts of the immigration system, particularly the points-based system, needs to be revised. So the key thing is that these are the institutional components that allow the immigration system to be successful. The way I see it is, in an analogy, American proposals for points-based systems were focusing on the menu, but we're not focusing on the restaurant. The menu can attract clientele, but can your restaurant adjust that menu dramatically and quickly? And that's the question, right? You need the right kitchen, you need the right staff, you need the right place to be able to bring in different clienteles. And I don't think this institutional focus is getting as much attention, especially around non-legislative changes done by the executive.
So, Mack, coming back to you, you did mention that your proposal does include some of these factors, right? You talked about collecting longitudinal data. But what about the idea? I mean, maybe the idea that yours is a pilot project and smaller can help with the messaging. But listening to Cris talk about those institutional factors, how do you think your proposal fits in?
So I think that our proposal, in terms of the first point that Cris brought up, which is the historical finding that countries that have adopted these kinds of programs did so largely by garnering public support for skilled immigration beforehand, and then that would support the passage of this kind of reform. We think that there is a broad-based support for this kind of program expanding skilled immigration and doing so in a transparent and fair way. We think that there's enough public support to be able to pass this through. And because we propose it as a standalone bill, it's kind of, if there's support for this one issue, it will not be watered down by opposition for, on other policy points that are included in the bill. In terms of the differences between the U.S. and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, in terms of their parliamentary versus a presidential system, absolutely. And they, one of the running through lines in the academic literature on points-based systems is that it's vitally important that they be flexible and transparent and easy to adjust to changes in the needs of the market or unexpected outcomes of the program itself. We fully acknowledge that the U.S. Does not allow for that kind of quick changes to immigration policy. But we argue that, yes, Theresa, as you point out, because this is a pilot program, because it's relatively small, if the design of the points table or of the application process results in some kind of unusual, unexpected outcome, and it's not ideally tailored to the needs of the U.S. economy right now, the cost is relatively low. But the other design element that we have is that because our program is explicitly designed to select for longer-term human capital needs of the U.S. economy, we think that it won't need to. Our program doesn't need to be as flexible because the demands of how it's supposed to function don't change as quickly as short-term labor needs. The long-term demand for highly educated, experienced workers in sectors that have been in demand, consistently over the last, say, 10 years, there's no reason to think that in terms of the U.S. labor market, that the need for those kinds of workers would reduce. And so the fine-grained differences in the points allocations we think is less important, and they don't need to be as flexible or easy to update immediately.
So, Cris, based on your research, do you agree with Mack and Professor Yale that their points-based system is realistic for the United States, or where do you think it might go?
Well, I think that point, though, that your points-based system addresses long-term needs, that may be the case, but for instance, Canada and Australia took the expression of interest system from New Zealand, which New Zealand basically said, okay, you get a certain number of points and you would get invited to be able to get a permanent residence, to be able to live and work there permanently. And then what they decided to do was the innovation was expression of interest, which is to say, okay, you pass the points threshold, but now we're going to start ranking you against other candidates that allow us to be able to make better selections of individuals who are higher ranked and allow us to clear the backlogs. And so Canada and Australia were able to implement that system with basically instantaneously, particularly in Canada, where they used an instrument called Orders in Council that basically said, we're going to change this and revise it quickly. And so that's what I'm talking about, agility, is that not only do you need agility to be able to adjust points and sometimes make, some pretty drastic revisions, you need agility to sometimes completely revise and overhaul the system writ large. And that's, I think, the big picture, is that, once again, I think in the U.S. we focus so much on points and meeting needs that we don't realize that you need a very agile system. And I think that that's the problem, is that when you're thinking points, the points aren't the big deal. The point is, do you have a flexible, dynamic system? So in terms of the question about realistic, I mean, I think that question about a dynamic, flexible system that can adjust to economic, social, or political contexts, I think that's where the challenge is going to be with this proposal. And I think one of the key issues with this is not even the institutional question about whether we have a parliamentary system and whether we have regulatory instruments to be able to make drastic changes to the system. I think the key policy or the key political issue is this whole notion about executive authority and how you're going to deal with that problem. Because what we've seen, especially under President Trump, is that you've seen a lot of power allocated to the executive, that he's been using a lot of that executive authority to change the immigration system in a variety of ways that I think has made Democrats hostile at the current moment to this. So the way you can think about it is, how can you depoliticize executive authority. And so I think the proposal here that's in discussion does try to address that with independent commissions. Now, is that going to create a system as dynamic as the one in Australia and Canada? No. But at least it's trying to sort of address that. And I think that that's probably the most important part, is that there's a acknowledgement to sort of have some independent body. And that, I think, also is an acknowledgement of the fact that our bureaucracy, in contrast to the one that exists in Canada and Australia, is heavily politicized. So how do you deal also with the issue of a politicized bureaucracy in the United States? So I think that that's where I think the proposal is trying to make some sort of, I think, address sort of the weaknesses that exist in the United States for creating a dynamic system. But, I think in terms of getting the public on board and gathering data, I certainly think that that's very realistic, and that's a recognition of what Canada and Australia do well. But I do think this whole notion of executive authority is where the challenge of implementing the system will come in. And like I said, it has nothing really to do with the proposal itself. It has to deal with the politics of executive authority that exists at the moment. And I think it's going to be an issue that's going to come up even if Vice President Biden wins. And we'll see conservatives criticize executive authority there.
So, Mack, last word to you. Where have you proposed this? I mean, obviously it's out in the public sphere, but what reception have you guys gotten to this, and where do you think it goes next?
The reception that we've seen so far has been largely positive. There has been some pushback on the question from you, Theresa, and others that took part in our launch event about whether this was a feasible prospect, about the political likelihood of this actually happening. But in terms of the design of the program itself, it seems as if there hasn't been any significant pushback. In terms of where we've put it out there, we've published it through Cornell Law School. We're working on getting it accepted to a peer-edited journal right now. And as to where it goes next, I know that Steve has continued to be in touch with a number of contacts in both Republican and Democratic policy circles. And ideally, this would go onto the desk of a congressional member that could put this out for a vote, and it would be. That's our goal. As to the question of the kind of flexibility of bureaucracy, absolutely. This is. It would be remarkably difficult and remarkably politically costly to try and revamp the entirety of the U.S. economic immigration in the style of, say, a Canadian or Australian point system. We actually don't even address that question in our report because it's so far down the road that it's kind of beyond the scope of our interest. Basically, what we want to address that cost of revamping or of upgrading or changing existing policy by proposing this de novo. It is a new program. It is separate from, it makes no changes to existing U.S. visa streams. And so it's kind of a small test case. So we hope in the new Congress in next year after the election, this would be a palatable kind of middle of the road small piece of immigration legislation that might be able to get through the congressional deadlock.
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with the election and where things go from that. Mack, Eason, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you so much for having me.
Immigration policy in the courts is a constant feature of this podcast, and with the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a number of immigration-related cases making their way through the federal court system could be affected. Theresa and Cris break it all down in this conversation. Take a listen.
Last month, Associate Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the major liberal justices on the court's bench, passed away at the age of 87. President Trump subsequently nominated Amy Coney Barrett as Justice Bader Ginsburg's conservative replacement on the court. Although Barrett's nomination raises questions about the future of reproductive rights and the Affordable Health Care Act and many other substantial cases that appear before the court, it also has implications about the court's role in shaping immigration policy in the future, as more immigration-related cases make their way to the Supreme Court. As we've been following here on This Week in Immigration and our segments on the gavel, litigation has been a hallmark of this administration when it comes to immigration policies. So Cris and I are going to take a few minutes now to talk about Justice Ginsburg's legacy on immigration issues before the court and where we think things might go. So Cris, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about Justice Ginsburg's legacy on immigration issues before the court. You know, she has been, as we said earlier, a stalwart liberal vote on the court, and that generally has meant ruling in cases that provide more benefits toward immigrants, that restricts some of the harsher enforcement mechanisms of the government, but is leaning toward finding immigrant justice. Most recently, she ruled in favor with the majority of preventing the administration from closing down the DACA program. So obviously, with her absence, cases like that may have a different outcome. Cris, what do you think?
I agree with that. I think, well, first, I think there needs to be the acknowledgement that big blockbuster Supreme Court cases on immigration policy is a relatively new phenomenon in comparison to other policy areas. If you really think about it, a lot of immigration litigation for a long time was largely around the adjudication of benefits for individuals or removals. But increasingly, you started seeing these bigger constitutional questions emerging. And that's where Justice Ginsburg really left her mark. Not only on this recent DACA case, for instance, the Supreme Court decision around Arizona versus the United States, around Arizona Law SB 1070, which Arizona passed, I believe, in 2010, that really essentially deputized local law enforcement to become immigration officials to be able to, whether to test whether or not an individual has legal status in the United States, and for removing them. I remember that being really one of the first major openings where she and the majority definitely tried to sort of limit the capacity of Arizona to pass these laws, and to kind of clarify the role between the federal government and the states' governments on immigration. And that seemed like it was a pretty big opening here. That happened during the Obama administration, but she has been reliably a stalwart on the left for immigration rights or immigration issues, whose gap I think will be felt significantly moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's important. That first point you mentioned is really relatively important. I mean, the Supreme Court in modern history, there have not been that many cases that are, as you mentioned, sort of big nationwide things that people kind of look at and go, that's as significant as, say, a Citizens United case or an Obergefell case, right? Like a lot of the cases that made it to the Supreme Court were about really arcane, detailed interpretations of removal criteria or due process issues in the removal context, or how a case that might be adjudicated based on the criteria in law. Even major APA-related regulatory cases didn't always make it to the Supreme Court. Many of them were adjudicated at lower courts. And it's really been, I think, in the last two administrations that we've seen these sort of major national cases that really are about the limits of executive authority in immigration. And if you look at a lot of the cases that are making their way up right now, it's those kind of cases. Think of cases like over the public charge regulations, for example, or again, the DACA or TPS cases that are going through, or the recent travel bans, visa bans since COVID, the asylum regulations that have been put forward. I mean, these are major cases that have significant implications for huge chunks of the immigration process in this country that are wending their way to the court. And so, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a reliable liberal vote in terms of more due process for immigrants and restraining some of the influences of the executive branch, let's switch it over. What do we know about Amy Coney Barrett and her immigration rulings in history?
So it's interesting because, she she certainly has played a role in advancing some of the Trump administration's policies that came before her as a judge. In particular, one of the things that she did do is in a panel review of the public charge rule, which we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. For those of you who don't know, is it's essentially a assessment as to whether or not an individual will use public benefits in the future or has used public benefits when assessing whether or not they can get a green card. The Trump administration, released an expanded version of that policy through a regulation, and it was subsequently sued. And she basically wrote a dissent against the decision that issued an injunction against it, basically saying that the administration has a right to block people who maybe become dependent on public assistance. So that's a really decision on her end, because the public charge rule has been one of the most important policies that the administration has advanced. She's also hasn't really reviewed cases brought by immigrants applying for humanitarian protection or other benefits that they have been denied. So certainly she comes a little bit more on the right spectrum, and it should be noted that the restrictionist think tank, the Center for Immigration Studies, came out with a full endorsement of her jurisprudence. So that should give you a sense of where she comes in there.
Yeah. So let's think about the makeup of the court, right? Assuming that she is going to be confirmed, and there's certainly the intention, it seems like, by Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to push through her nomination as quickly as possible. And remember, Supreme Court justices only need 51 votes to be nominated and approved by the Senate, and the Republicans still have that majority. That would make, in theory, the court a 6-3 conservative court if Justice Roberts is considered a conservative. Now, we have seen Justice Roberts on immigration issues kind of sometimes side on different sides of things. So it's not entirely clear that he would be a consistent conservative vote on some of these issues. Again, he voted with the majority to say that the administration could not terminate DACA, but he also voted with the majority to allow the travel ban to continue, for example. But if you have a 6-3 presumably conservative majority on the court, one of the primary defense strategies of the immigration activists in the era of Trump has been to take it to court. And they've been relatively successful, particularly at lower court stages, with national injunctions against many of Trump's policies, with some of them making it to the Supreme Court, although, again, not all of them, and far fewer. What do you think the implications of a 6-3 conservative majority on the court would be for that strategy?
I think that what will happen, and we've talked about this on this podcast quite a bit, is that it could set up the possibility that can set legal precedent that says, for instance, that the executive branch has the authority to be able to enact these policies, or that the underlying constitutional components of these policies are in fact legal. And as a result, what you get is that cases that you thought were going to overturn a policy end up reinforcing it. And that, I think, is the thing that the litigation strategy, I don't think, ever anticipated, which the assumption was, well, we'll keep winning. But, as these cases move up through the federal court system, the assumption was that maybe we'll be dealing with the current formation of the court. And of course, now that's changed. All of a sudden, the strategy that assumed, well, we'll just take it to the Supreme Court and we'll win. I think now that strategy may not be as valid for reaching the goals that the immigration advocates had wanted when they started this litigation. So I think that's one implication of.
Well, and I would say that, just to add on to that, the flip side of that is Trump has said, from his point of view, he thinks that the court is already on his side, right? He has said, "Oh, we'll take it to the Supreme Court and we'll win." And so there's some sense that he's pushing a lot of these policies because he believes that eventually the Supreme Court will rule in his favor. So he may have been relying on sort of the mirror opposite litigation strategy, if you will, right?
Right. I think that really came up once the travel ban case was ruled by the Supreme Court. That's when you started seeing the administration becoming increasingly aggressive with the release of these different policies, and that both sides said, "Well, you know what? We'll just take it to court," or basically the administration is going to release it. They know that it's going to get sued, and then the assumption was post the Hawaii decision and the travel ban. All right, we'll just go to the Supreme Court and we'll win. So I think that's the thing, is that there was sort of the litigation was always going to be the strategy of the advocates. I think once the Hawaii decision came out, the administration felt significantly more emboldened. But the question, of course, is sort of what is the alternative to just suing everything that comes into place, or just releasing executive actions, right? Then that's the question moving forward for the development of immigration policy.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of articles written recently about, what if Biden is elected? How hard would it be for him to overturn a lot of what Trump has done? And a lot of it is focusing on, the executive orders or regulation. But one thing that I haven't seen a lot of attention paid to is how a Biden administration would deal with the ongoing court cases. Because while it may be very simple to overturn an executive action by a subsequent executive action, for example, the administration inherits all of the existing court cases against the prior administration's actions. And it can decide to continue to try to defend the former policy or not. But those cases continue unless they're settled or ended. The other thing for consideration for a Biden presidency is whether or not and how much he would want to rely on his own executive authority to undo things, if that executive authority is the crux of what a lot of these court cases are about. So if you presume that a conservative majority on the Supreme Court might, for example, uphold a decision out of the Fifth Circuit in Texas that DACA itself was illegal when created, not the recent Supreme Court case that said Trump terminated DACA incorrectly, but a court case that might very well rule that DACA in and of itself was illegal when created, that might change your opinion of how far you want to go with your own executive actions, correct?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, this summer, you saw the Sanders-Biden Unity Task Force recommendations come out for immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, if it wasn't explicitly stated, it was strongly implied that a lot of these actions would, at least proactive actions, would be done through executive action. Again, based on the assumption that the composition of the Supreme Court wasn't going to change, or at least maybe that wasn't thought through. Whatever the case may be, the assumption was we're going to use executive actions. And I think, as he noted, the capacity to be able to use that as a mechanism for developing immigration policy, you may just simply see a repeat of the Trump years, or even at the beginning of, towards the end of the Obama administration with the DAPA case, for instance, providing deferred protection for the parents of DACA recipients. That pattern that started at the end of the Obama administration, continued through the Trump administration, and may continue through a hypothetical Biden administration, really then raises the question of, okay, if executive action is going to be subject to lawsuits, what are the alternatives? And of course, the alternative is legislation. And that's something that hasn't been outlined in the Biden Sanders Unity Task Forces clearly. Certainly has not been outlined in any way by what President Trump has outlined for his priorities for immigration, to the extent that he's articulated them. Neither side really is walking and thinking, let's talk about legislation. But in reality, legislation probably is the most robust way to make changes. But it just doesn't seem like either side wants to flex that muscle right now.
Yeah. Well, lots to be seen. Cris, thanks so much for joining us as always. And we hope you, our listener, will join us again for Next Week in Immigration. And Jordan Lapierre, our stalwart host, will be back then. Thanks for joining us.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite platform. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Cris Ramón and myself. Our producers are Cris Ramón and Yafet Tawahara, and our editor is Yafet Tawahara. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. I'm Jordan Lapierre. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.